The distinction between vampires and players who siphon also becomes blurred when considering players who happen to be inorganic entities, such as Pitching Machine, who, to date, appear to have consumed nothing but blood. The Blaseball Wiki. Entry on Vampires. The Daily Grind. Chapter 218. Malcolm McHarn's phone rang exactly twice before he picked it up. It was a desk phone, which meant that in this building, everything he said on this conversation would be recorded and archived so an analyst could check it if needed. It was also his personal desk phone, which meant that recording would get lost. Not because he was pulling any particular espionage tricks, but because his basement office and everything that happened in it tended to be forgotten. "McHarn," he answered, crisply bringing the black plastic bar of the phone's receiver up to his ear. "Hey, Malcolm, James Lyle," the voice on the other end spoke. A young man's voice that nevertheless made Malcolm's blood chill. He set the phone back down on his desk, stood up, walked across the ornate rug that he'd gotten to cover the otherwise barren floor of the small office, and locked his door with a nod to his newest assistant as he shut the blinds on the door's inset window. Then he deliberately made his way back to his desk, picked up the phone again, and took a deep breath. "This line isn't secure," he said. "Oh, it's fine," James told him with an easy tone. "Decay isn't in the building, and I trust you've swept your own office for bugs. Also, I've got someone on the phone thing. Don't worry about that." "What idiot would be stupid enough to bug the office of a deputy director of the FBI?" McHarn asked, rhetorically. He knew the answer to that. It was one of his own subordinates, the one who apparently wasn't in the building. "Well, what do you need?" There was a pause that sounded like a wince to his experience hearing people give reports over the phone. "Well," James started slowly, "I've got a little information for you. So, have you been settling into your job?" "Badly. Get to the point." Malcolm was a lot of things today, but ready for small talk from an informant wasn't one of them. "Okay, we've identified the group we believe is responsible for your killings." Lyle's tone snapped to businesslike in an instant, and McHarn pulled a yellow legal pad and a freshly sharpened pencil out of his desk to start scratching notes to himself. "I've got a name and a location for you, but this isn't free." "What do you want?" McHarn's face twisted into a scowl. "Safeguarding the country's stability isn't enough for you?" "You know it super isn't," James laughed at him. "Remember, I believe murder is wrong, not that oil executives are good. Do not confuse the two. I don't give a shit about economic stability paid for with blood money. We are way more personal here. You asked nicely, we're helping you. Not the FBI, not your special division. You." Something about the way the young man phrased that unsettled Malcolm. He rapidly wiped the back of one hand across his smooth forehead before he responded. "Fine. What do you want for the information?" "At their home base, these people have a series of blueprints," James said simply. "We want them. As well as one other thing that we don't know the shape of yet. Everything else, take it as evidence or whatever. You'll probably like the helicopter. Call it an early Christmas gift." "That's all?" Malcolm's eyebrows rose ever so slightly, even with no one in the office to see. "Decay made it pretty clear you were extorting our discretionary budget when she worked with you." "That was then. This is now," James said. "Do you want the intel or not?" "Go ahead." "Alright, you're looking for a group called Priority Earth. They were an eco-terrorist group operating for the last 20 years or so, using the kind of tactics your division was made to fight, as far as we can tell. Something happened to them, probably recently, to change their behavior and ideology, but they're still in your wheelhouse. I've got a set of GPS coordinates here for you. You got a pen?" James waited for confirmation and then rattled off a series of numbers while McHarn wrote rapidly. "There's another group there too, mercenaries working with them. They're all fairly heavily armed, so be careful. Maybe 30 or 40 people total." James paused and then added slowly, "I've also got a bit of speculation if you want that." "Sorting speculation out of noise is my job," McHarn said smoothly. "Right. Neat. Well, if you ever want to defect, let us know. We could use someone who's good at that. Anyway, Priority Earth? We think they're being used as a diversionary tactic, likely by an entity called the Last Line of Defense. Malcolm desperately wanted to ask James how he pronounced the capital letters in that name, but instead he focused on the relevant details. Motive? Unknown, but we know it's dangerous. If you've noticed that there's a city missing from the US, you can blame the line for that, James told him in a grim voice. Malcolm nodded, a similar grim look on his own face. I have. Morocco. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then a slow voice saying, Morocco is still around? Morocco, Ohio. McCarn knew he didn't have to give this information away for free, but so far, the Order of Endless Rooms was paying dividends as a contact, and the more James Lyle trusted him, the more he was going to get out of this overall. Though he did make a note to find the other missing city, while in the background of their call he heard James's voice yelling for someone to find a man named Nate. You won't find anything there. Malcolm saved him some time. Literally nothing. It's like the place never was. Well, that's fucking terrifying, James said. Agreed. Anything else for me? Not right now. A tiny pause, and then, how's Decay doing? She's being handled, Malcolm said. Tiffany Decay wasn't useless, unfortunately. She was an unnervingly good field agent when he actually had something to point her at. Her opinions were dangerous, but that wasn't enough to have her fired. Not in the current political climate. And especially not with the fact that Malcolm wasn't sure if anybody but payroll remembered his department existed. As far as she knows, I have a direct line of intelligence on your organization, so we're biding our time until you're too much of a problem to ignore. Do you? James asked with a smile on his voice. We're talking, aren't we? Tell me, how many people are in your organization? McCarn made a joking effort to secure a small tidbit of intel for himself. Define people, was not the response that he had expected. I suppose I walked into that one. If I say humans, I'm not going to get an accurate answer, am I? Nope. Everyone always assumed when aliens arrived they'd call the White House. Maybe the Kremlin? Yeah, you guys be weird about it, James said. Anyway, call me when you're ready to lose some evidence. There was a click, and Malcolm's phone went quiet. Gently, he settled the plastic handset back in its place and took a deep breath. He had liked it more when Lyle was a little intimidated by him and his government agency status. With each conversation he had with the younger man, some of that faded away, and he got to see more of who he actually was. A snarky, unprofessional, fundamentally compassionate human who had to work very hard to repress his disrespect of authority figures whenever he talked to Malcolm. And yet, infuriatingly, this was the best lead his office had gotten in weeks. Part of him wanted to know how James had done it. Mind reading, maybe? It would have sounded silly a few months ago, but nothing was off the table anymore, was it? Malcolm looked down at the paper he'd written a set of coordinates on. Alaska, huh? He took a deep breath and stood up. He had calls to make, field agents to retask, law enforcement to coordinate with, and at least 2 other department heads that he could draw on for resources and manpower. Maybe they'd forget his department existed, but he was a deputy director, damn it, and they didn't need to know anything about his job to give him what he needed. They'd play it safe, but if this panned out, this could be a major star for his career, not to mention a chance at some real answers besides. But first, he needed to figure out what he was going to tell his most problematic asset. That went well, James told Nate as he hung up the phone on his end. I still say we could have taken them, JP protested from his spot at the table. There were a handful of other rogue division members around, listening in, but mostly the briefing warehouse was empty because it was fairly early morning for everyone here. JP just hadn't slept last night and was getting increasingly irritable, which was a sharp contrast to James, who actually had slept, for a change, and was only up this early because he and Alana had a dungeon date. There's, what, 20 guys? I could have taken them. JP leaned forward on his elbows, cracking his knuckles in a ball of hands as he spoke. Nate and James ignored him. They'd been over this already. Smooth enough, Nate admitted. You didn't need to give away our membership having species as a factor, though. Yeah, I want him to be used to it when it comes up. Besides, he's met debt. James shrugged. Anyway, think he'll hold up his end? I'd say so. He's not our friend, but he's thinking of you as an asset now. He won't want to burn that yet. It'll help that he won't know what the blueprints are. Nate scratched a thumbnail along his chin and thought. So, what are your orders for us now? He swept that same hand out to show off the rest of the rogues. Ben's eyes snapped up from the laptop he was rapidly tapping at. He doesn't give us orders, he said, bluntly. I didn't even realize we got orders. I thought we were freelance spies, another rogue chimed in. While Nate was busy shaking his head and looking like he was about to bite their heads off, James snorted a laugh and jumped in. I've actually got 2 things for you guys. 1, keep on New York. Something's still happening there. Just don't push it. We can benefit from knowing more, but it's not critical anymore. 2, track down some of the people and places we got from the priority camp and check them out. Same reason. Low stakes adventure. Woo! A girl off to the side threw up her hands. Also, I'm not a guys. Guys is gender neutral, JP protested. Okay, how many guys have you slept with? The rogue gave him a toothy grin, and James had the sudden question of if JP was exclusively recruiting people that drove him personally insane to add to his growing cadre of spies. James answered in place of JP. Between 1 and 12, depending on how you count a Nesh, he said. But I take your meaning. Nate, do you need anything else from me today? We're good. Get out of here. Thanks. And good job, everyone, getting us this far. James nodded at them before turning to walk away. In the end, it had been simple. The Order was growing, both in size and strength, but they couldn't handle every problem, and they didn't need to pick every single fight that showed up at their door. But the FBI was at its peak in terms of power, and they already wanted to know about what they'd uncovered here, so solve 2 problems at once. Tell McHarn enough of the real truth to set him and his government goons on the actual dangerous bombers, hopefully remove an opponent from the board, score trust points with an FBI deputy director, take a chance on getting access to the magical blueprints, and if they were really lucky, mildly inconvenience whatever the last line of defense was doing in New York. Clean, efficient, easy, several problems solved at once with their phone call. The FBI could handle the violent terrorist group with assault rifles, and the Order could get back to what they were meant to be doing. Building the future, and finding new magic to do it. So James was feeling pretty smug as he walked out of the briefing warehouse into the early morning activities of the lair. It was almost 5 a.m., which meant there was less life happening around here, but not none at all. Especially as he headed back to the dining room to get some breakfast. Nate might not be cooking, but they had an actual kitchen staff now, and Elle's mom made great bacon. James ate while he watched response members trading out shifts, listened in on a conversation between 2 exhausted engineers about building a city out of a space elevator, and nodded a quick hello to Karen and Texture of Bark Dust as the 2 women sat down for their own breakfast with the motions of solidifying habit. He had just finished his egg and toast when Alana dramatically swept herself across the seat across from him and took a slice of his bacon with her. Yo! His girlfriend greeted him as she toppled the chair back onto all 4 legs after her impact. You ready? More or less. Neck still aches, but I got ibuprofen. James gave a small shrug. Turns out you can't walk off getting shot. Who knew? Well, I mean, obviously not us. The authorities are awesome, aren't they? Alana asked rhetorically. I'm thinking, would you mind if I bonded with one? When the hive mind makes more, obviously. James cocked an eyebrow. Now that's an odd thought. Do you actually have a position that one would thrive off of? I do response stuff. Alana looked almost hurt. Hell, I pretty much just do response stuff, she added, her voice getting more contemplative. That and hanging out with you. Fuck, wait, am I getting boring? Never, James answered easily. Also, you hang out with Anesh, but yeah, I don't know, maybe take some time off. That's what we're doing today. Alana bounced back to being excited, rubbing her palms together after she crammed the rest of James's bacon in her mouth. Dungeon things. Oh, also, speaking of Anesh, he is seriously thinking of quitting NASA. You should talk to him about it. You know I'm absolutely just going to tell him to do it, though, right? James asked her as he stood and cleared his table, dropping the dishes into the plastic tub by the kitchen's side door. It's not making him happy, even if he is actively using his enormous brain. Alana leaned down to bump shoulders with James as she hopped up and started walking next to him. The two of them headed down into the basement that contained the Order's armory. Yeah, she said, sharing some inconvenient physical contact with her boyfriend. That's why I want you to talk to him. He needs a nudge, and then he'll be around more. There's 3 of him around already, James laughed. And there could be 4. Alana cocked her head to stare up at the ceiling of the stairwell, pausing on the landing above James. Think of the possibilities! And, you know, the mental well-being of the guy we love, who is burning out because one of him is constantly alone. That's the important part, really, James agreed as he held the door open for her. Anyway, you ready to go on a hike? Alana didn't have a great answer to that. In theory, the two of them were excited to be going into a dungeon in a couple hours. But despite all the wonder at the magic and the sensation that James couldn't deny of feeling kind of badass wearing the armor, climbing harness, and gear loadout, there was something about Winter's Climb that wasn't exactly fun. Officiamundi was fun. Terrifying and easy to get lost in, full of constant, dangerous creatures, but also packed with small adventures, small discoveries. Route Horizon was fun. Terrifying and easy to get lost in, and populated by occasional oversized monsters, but also a thrill to drive through and to experience the sunsets of. Winter's Climb was cold. It was unfun, in the same way the Akashic Sewer was unfun, though in fairness it did smell a lot better. You couldn't ever be comfortable in it, though. There was that endless pressure of the cold and the wet and the wind that made it hurt just to be in the dungeon space. But both of them wanted to get high enough to unlock a second spell slot, and also there was so much they hadn't seen of the place. Getting equipped was easier than it had been the first time. The Order was ready for the mountain dungeon these days. Dry suits and armor plate, climbing harnesses, hatchets and pistols, no rifles, not since the Avalanche incident. Flares, breaker gloves, exercise potions, coffee thermoses, ski goggles that were enchanted to show where things were going to fall. They had several copies of those, just for when one of them inevitably broke. All that physical gear was mixed with clicking a .bat file on a terminal in the armory that set them as the users of a handful of the resistance programs that they had built up copies of, making each of them roughly 10% resistant to wood and venom, both of which were worryingly useful things to be resistant to during a climb delve. And then, because they were a little early, they had about half an hour of lounging around upstairs, waiting for the rest of their team. Because even though James and Alana were grinning in anticipation of their dungeon date, they were not stupid enough to do it without backup. Especially when there was a specialized Winter's Climb team that was around today anyway. Hey guys! Ethan greeted them with excitement when he found them waiting. Ethan was, admittedly, too easily excited, and James remembered it grating on him when he was trying to save the younger man's life from Officiamundi. But these days, that enthusiasm was tempered a little bit with experience. He had turned into a fine team lead. He was already outfitted like James and Alana, and gestured behind himself as he introduced them to the rest of the Delvers. This is Marlia, he said, a sweep of his hand indicating 2 women with him that nodded and made a quick greeting in perfect unison. Spirecast behind, and Rudger, who is a good dragon. The Camerconda was armored and had a four-limbed motorized backpack on, making her look a little bit like a spider, and already riding on the back of the laminated paper dragon, Rudger, who was nowhere near the size of Pendragon yet, but the drake was more than large enough to support the Camerconda nestled in a groove on his back. "Hey," James nodded to all of them. "Okay, I've been meaning to ask about this. Are you two always connected, like Simon and James were?" he asked Marlia. "Is that rude to ask? I don't know if we have Skulljack etiquette yet." "Oh yeah, we are." The two women nodded. "It's not rude, though I use a singular pronoun, please." "Wait, what?" Alana tilted her head. "Are you going full hive mind with this?" "Absolutely." Marlia's shared voice harmonized with herself. "I'm literally twice the person either of my component lives were. I think everyone else is crazy for not wanting to explore this more. I've got a couple essays written if you're interested." "Kinda, yeah," Alana said, surprising herself even. "But after this." "Yeah, you two ready?" Ethan asked. "We got a stable and easy route mapped out that'll take us the first 1,200 feet up in about 4 hours, but after that, we'll need to press kinda hard to make it to a structure of shelter before we continue. Unless you want to do a broader explanation and you're not just going for your second spell slot." "It's weird seeing you be professional," James muttered. Though really what he struggled with more was the sudden realization that professional dungeon delver was actually a thing that was solidifying in the Order of Endless Rooms as a real job. "We'll follow your lead," he added, more loudly. "But maybe after we make camp we can do some poking around. There is always more to find, it seems." "Absolutely. Alright, let's go." Ethan nodded as he held out a hand, a telepad ready to take them almost directly to the foot of the mountain that Winter's Climb tended to grab people away from. James and Alana laced their fingers together and slapped their palms into the circle of contact with the others. Shortly after that, they were gone from their home base in Oregon and appearing in the middle of a hiking trail in Australia. They barely had time to get their bearings before a chunk of angry ball lightning in the shape of an archway dragged them off through a hole in the world to somewhere else. Snow crunched under James's boot as he flanked Alana, the two of them moving as part of the line of delvers as they pushed through the gently sloping knee-high white ground. It was the kind of snow that had something like a shell over its surface. Not quite a frozen layer of ice, just enough that it could crack and then give all at once with every single step. Enough to make walking even more exhausting, but not impossible. Not a constant tripping hazard. No, that honor went to the tangles of roots buried in the snow. Intellectually, James was aware of the fact that they were ascending a mountain and not a parking lot, but the constant reminder that there were protruding roots and a layer of shifting pine needles underfoot was frustrating. It made it even more important to take each step carefully to focus on the act of walking, which was stacked on top of focusing on staying ahead of the slowly creeping storm wall behind them, focusing on not being ambushed by stick bugs or snow beasts, focusing on keeping an eye out for any incoming ice artillery from the benign-looking sky, and focusing on not getting too far apart from each other while doing all of this. James and Alana were part of the left wing of their formation, with Ethan on the far outside. Marlia took up the right side of the line, her two bodies moving in unison and keeping close. Spire cast behind stayed in the middle of their formation, the laminated drake he was riding trailing behind them and following the trail Alana was leaving as it was the easiest thing to walk through. Rudger might have been the size of a horse, but most of his motion was magical and not physical, and plowing through 2-foot-high untouched snow was hard for the big guy, especially since he was also wearing saddlebags with half their gear in them. So they made it easy for him and let him follow along in their partially cleared paths, while Spire cast behind kept a watch out for anything hostile approaching from atop the mount. They'd been moving for almost half an hour, and James's legs were starting to burn with that low fire of sustained, stressful exercise. The kind of feeling that made him smugly know that he could keep this up for hours without a break, that made him revel in the body that he had now, shaped by a combination of magic and hard work. Still, it was worth noting that the only reason he was starting to feel the ache in his calves not already collapsing from exertion was that Ethan and his team were leading them on a pretty easy path. Oh, sure, there were tripping hazards, and the cold of the snow wrapped around their legs was kept back by carefully planned gear and nothing else. But the slope was gentle, nothing tried to directly attack them yet, and there hadn't been any ice spikes falling from the sky. Winter's Climb, it turned out, was a pretty stable dungeon a lot of the time. The Order still didn't have enough to put together a full picture yet, but in his head, James did have a few classifications for the dungeons. In this case, stable was in contrast to shifting. The Akashic Sewer and Clutter Ascent were both shifting dungeons, maybe just because they were new. Maybe it was something dungeons grew out of as they figured out how they liked things settled. But Route Horizon went in the shifting category too. Its roads sort of had a pattern to them, but it wasn't 100% predictable. Officia Mundi, though, was mostly stable. It could change. It did that thing where it tended to reset parts of itself sometimes, occasionally mixing up larger pathways, but the actual big picture map of it stayed the same from week to week. Just like the climb, where if you were a group of dedicated explorers, you could start to route out the best way to get from the screaming cliffs that the entrance dropped you in to the height of 2,000 feet needed to get the second spell slot. It annoyed James immensely that the climb used feet. It was in Australia, technically. He considered complaining about this to Alana, but then he would have to speak pretty loudly to be heard over the sporadic blasts of sharp wind, and they were both in the groove right now. Step, push down, test the ground, pull forward, 1 foot at a time to maximize stability, play it safe. They had plenty of time, they were already ahead of the storm. The other thing that was annoying about this place was, despite being stable, it did the Officia Mundi thing of stripping away the guide ropes and climbing pitons that they tried to leave behind. It meant that a lot of their navigation was done by landmark, and there were also no promises that those would stay where they were either. But the dungeon hadn't completely screwed them over just yet. James corrected his hiking spacing as he got too close to Ethan. Their line was spread out for a reason. They were close enough to help each other, but not so close that a single tripwire trap could take out more than one of them. Ideally, they just wouldn't trigger any traps, but this dungeon really liked putting things under the snow. It actually got kind of silly after the fourth time either Ethan or Spirecast behind called out a space they should avoid stepping. James knew that experience with a dungeon could make a person look really impressive to someone who was new, but he'd been here before, and he had no idea how they were spotting the trip lines. "We go left up here." Ethan's voice was projected to be heard, but he wasn't yelling as he pointed to the ridge they were approaching. "The outcrop stops. We can keep climbing the hill in about a quarter mile." "Got it," Alana called back, checking for a nod from James for good measure. They pressed on until they made their way to the base of the rocks they had been headed for. It wasn't a sheer cliff or anything, it was more like a pile of boulders that had been stacked up and gradually had the rest of the world fill in with dirt and snow and plants around them. And if Ethan was right, it wasn't a very long barrier either. They could just climb it, but climbing freehand in this place was a worrying prospect, and even if it took a little extra time, it was worth saving the energy and the risk to just go around. They lined up near the rocks and turned to start moving, Ethan taking the lead now ahead of them. On their left, as they moved, a thin collection of anemic pine trees started to appear in their line of sight out of the thin snow, while the rocks to their right kept their vision a little clearer as they blocked some of the wind. The trees here, James remembered, tended to be ambush points, or maybe nests, for the weird long-limbed stick monsters, so he was keeping an eye on them closely, even if he knew that Spirecast behind was probably also doing the same. That was why he didn't catch the motion from the rocks to his right as something sinuous darted out for him. Alana caught it, though, one hand moving in a blur as she snapped across James's field of vision to grab the snake that had lashed out at him by whatever part of a snake the neck was. James's brain caught up to the motion just as the thing started to writhe in her grip, trying to sink long fangs that glittered like ice into her arm. Alana squeezed it, and then, even through the mask and goggles, James could see her face twist in confusion as the snake didn't die or even seem to be overly bothered by her crushing grasp. He focused on the thing quickly and saw coils that were too rough, segments of a body that were more like chunks of rock than flesh. Moving quickly, and saving time it would take to communicate this to Alana, he dipped his mind down to the status quo breaker glove that he was wearing, triggered the effect that shattered stone, and lashed out with a tightly controlled short punch, putting the force of his whole body behind it. His gloved fist connected with the stone snake's head, where it was currently sticking up out of Alana's grip as she tried to hold it away from her face, and the snake exploded. Chunks of wet stone and an explosion of blood like pure melted ice splattered across the snow ahead of them with a bang that echoed off the terrain. No stopping the movement, James let the tug on his awareness guide him and set his feet to Alana's right, pivoting just in time to jam another punch through the center of a second snake that lunged out of its nest in the rocks at him. That one, too, simply exploded as he hit it, the creature's body popping in a rippling shock wave as the magically enhanced impact traveled down its rock body with another bang. Catching on, Alana switched to a stance that brought her own breaker glove up, but no more serpents jumped out at them. Seconds later, the rest of the team clustered around them, the big laminated drake shoving his body in between the group and the trees like a wall, everyone on high alert. "We're good," James told them as he caught his breath. "Couple of rock snakes, which I guess are a thing?" "Not usually around here, but yeah," Marlia said, her dual voice carrying well over the wind that had died down temporarily. "Their fangs are actually a kind of sapphire, if you want a souvenir." She looked to Ethan, who was sweeping the line of trees with his eyes. "More importantly, the noise will attract anything nearby. We should move quickly." James and Alana nodded and got ready to hustle when it became clear that it was too late. A half-dozen wooden figures had dropped out of the trees and were closing the gap to them, long, spindly limbs and nothing else. The stick creatures were basically nothing but long, spindly limb, with all the sharp bits dripping with dendrification venom. One of them froze, then another, then a third, as the first one started moving again. Spire cast behind, using his paralyzing gaze to stagger out their approach. "All right, everyone back." Ethan's voice was tight. "6 of them. Be on the lookout for others. We'll repel their first hits and then see if they follow us." James and Alana shot each other a confused look. "Or let us handle it?" Alana said to Ethan, who gave her an equally confused look back. "Yeah, we got this." She nodded as she and James stepped past Ethan, who tried to grab their arms and yell something cautionary at them, but they just stepped up to the front and unhooked the hatchets off their armor. "Ready?" Alana asked James. "Set," he replied, his heart starting to hammer. Not in fear, though, or even excitement, really, just simple anticipation for a fight for his life. The two of them dared one more look at each other before the first 3 stick creatures made it to them. "Go!" Alana's voice held a feral glee that James didn't quite feel himself as she burst forward, a side-armed swing of her axe leaving a green splatter of blood-adjacent fluid on the snow. James followed, his own weapon moving quickly and efficiently as he tore into the incoming monsters. With support from a Camerconda that had a little bit of elevation, this was hardly even a fight, really. In no time at all, he and Alana had mopped up the incoming ambush and were catching their breath, ready to get moving again. "What the fuck was that?" Marlia demanded as they used handfuls of snow to wipe the green blood off their axes before reholstering them. "What was what?" James asked, his heart starting to slow down. "You just went right through them," Ethan said, his voice subdued now, hard to hear over the growing strength of the gusts that were chasing after them. We don't... We normally fight, sure, but not like that. I mean, it's... James paused as he realized that nothing he had to say here would actually sound very reassuring. I don't know what to tell you guys, I guess. He shrugged lamely. Though I'm actually fine fighting more defensively. We'll try to work with your formations from now on, if you want. Yeah. Ethan looked uncertain. They moved on, but it was a while before the others stopped shooting looks at James and Lana when they thought the two wouldn't notice. It got old after the third time he noticed. For fuck's sake, we don't have a case of the bloodlusts. James would have thrown his hands up if he weren't starting to get tired. Stop being so weird about it, he declared as they made their way up an embankment that was actually somewhat bare of snow, following the bank of a thin stream of water that flowed down from somewhere up ahead. You're making this weird, he grumbled as he tested a patch of ground and found it too icy to step on. His words actually did break them out of their apprehension. Well, the humans, anyway. Spirecast behind was completely used to that level of violence. It was just Ethan and Marlia who were more cautious and reserved when it came to fighting. They were Delvers. They did fight all the time. It was just that, to them, fighting was a defensive action that ended when the things attacking them pulled back, not when they eliminated everything moving. Which actually surprised James. They talked some more as they kept climbing. Winter's climb, it turned out, was a little more natural with its wildlife. Oh, there was a lot of evidence the monsters were straight-up monsters and not part of an ecosystem or even particularly sentient, but they did display some weird behaviors and tactics sometimes. The stick things, for example, actually would pull back if they didn't manage to seriously injure anyone within a minute or two of ambushing. Even if they weren't hurt themselves, they would just walk away. It had become a habit of their team to weather the fights, trusting in their armor, magic, and Camerconda to get them through without injury, without having to expend the extra effort to actually fight to the death and kill everything that was coming after them. Part of James thought that was kind of weird, and especially unsafe since it left an enemy at their backs. But it had literally never been an issue for them. Once they were past the ambush, the stick things didn't try again, just returning to their trees to wait for their next chance. And really, he'd only been here maybe 3 times, while Ethan and his team had come through every few days. They'd been in here about 30 delves, and as Alana pointed out, this time they were the experts. Which became apparent with how quickly they set up a climbing line when they reached the first cliff of their trip. It wasn't a straight line of rock or a sheer cliff or anything. They probably could have done it freehand without too much of a problem. But Marlia went first, hammering pitons into the stone and leaving behind a line the rest of them could clip their harnesses to. Ascending was a matter of minutes to go up what felt like 20 or 30 feet. Maybe even a little faster for James, who had Zhu helping him find perfect footholds as he ascended, the navigator exerting a small amount of his energy to help out, even though he was mostly keeping back unless needed. Apparently he didn't like the cold. Once the majority of them were at the top, they all worked together to help haul up Rudger. The big drake might have been mostly made of paper and plastic, but he still weighed a lot. Alana had asked why he didn't just fly up over these bits as she dug her feet in and strained her muscles to provide the lift the drake needed to claw his way more easily up the stone, and she'd gotten the answer that the climb did not like it when you flew in here. It barely tolerated drones. It absolutely would not put up with anyone alive trying to skip any of its obstacles. Ice strikes became more frequent, the wind would start to get sharp enough to flay someone alive, and if anyone was more than a few feet off the ground for too long, it felt like the entire dungeon turned against them. They had tried it once, and only barely got out without injuries via telepad. Marlia brought the rope in, retrieved most of the pitons, and the group pressed on, keeping ahead of the storm wall behind them. They were making good time, and so they kept to the route the team had traced out ahead of time. Skipping a few shallow overhangs in the rocks, taking a trail that kept them away from the frozen lakes that everyone was still perfectly reasonably nervous about, and heading up at a quick pace to the first stopping point they had planned. By the time they saw the first traffic light, standing proudly in the growing flurries of icy white that were coming down, everyone had downed at least one exercise potion to keep themselves fresh, and James was ready to take a break. The green pool of light that splashed out across the snow like an uneven ring of paint did have a magical quality to it. Not literal magic, but a more emotional spell, the feeling of a world that had been quieted by the storm, where light and color were like islands in the cold. It was also, he knew, a sign they had started to get near a building. No one knew yet, even the experienced exploration team for this very dungeon, if the colors on those lone traffic lights meant anything, but James took the green as a good sign as they filed past. Though he did frown into his ski mask as he tried to remember if Australia used blue and not green, and if this dungeon was once again screwing with him. He became absolutely certain it was when they reached the shelter marked on the map. The fact that the building was surrounded by a patch of absolutely no trees at all was strange, but the realization that it actually had a parking lot was weirder. It was the rotting and broken remains of the sign on the front of the one-story office complex that really made James unsettled, though. What looked like half a massive human tooth, black cracks running down its frame, a crown of snow piled on top in a cone, sat just above the shattered front windows of the building that they were apparently going to take a rest in. "You brought us to a dentist's office," James stated flatly as they stepped inside, alert for anything moving in the interior. He could think of a million horrible things that could come from a dentist's office. He did not want to be here. But nothing moved. The front lobby was silent and dark, nothing left of the reception area but waterlogged appointment books and broken piles of junk that used to be phones. Ethan said it was safe, but all of them still swept the building for anything dangerous before they found places to sit and take a breather. "I assume you searched here before?" James asked. "We did, but we didn't find anything useful," Marlia said with a shrug. "Though some of the dentist's tools could be. There was actually a drill the first time that should still work, but we didn't take it because, well, how do you test that?" Alana winced, grinding her teeth together. "Ah, that could go bad. I'm imagining it vaporizing someone's mouth now. Eh." She twisted, splaying her hands in front of her to ward off the thought. "But like, you didn't find any spellbooks here?" "The spell textbooks?" Ethan asked. "No, annoyingly. There was half a dental hygiene textbook here, but it wasn't enough to work, and we didn't find anything else." He glared at the frozen tile floor where they'd set up in the back office space, trying to get away from the wind pushing through the broken front windows into the lobby. It wasn't that much warmer, but at least without the wind it was quieter, and they could sit for a little. "Mar thinks it's because this is the easy route." "Oh?" James quirked an eyebrow at the pair of women. "The dungeons want to challenge us," Marlia shrugged. "It makes sense, there's better prizes in the harder parts. We're still doing it here, but I think it's fair enough that the hike without the ice spikes has less free reward in it." "Conjecture," Spire cast behind punctuated the word with a Camerconda hiss. "From my origin point, I am no more difficult to kill than one of the Shalaxi creatures. Why do I reward more?" "You can stop things from moving by looking at them," Alana offered, making a finger gun out of her gloved hand to punctuate the statement. "Also, this does kind of line up with Officiamundi more than anything else. The deeper places always have more stuff in them, even if it's just cash." "It's so fucking weird we don't find cash in other dungeons, by the way," James added to his girlfriend's words. "Also, how long are we resting?" "I'm good," Ethan said. "Me too," Marlia added her voices. The Drake just rustled as he stood back up, apparently used to this kind of talk. James cracked his knuckles and pulled the goggles back down. Time to get moving again. It was strange how almost entirely uneventful the climb was. Oh, it wasn't easy by any stretch. The storm felt like it was closing in from all sides, the sky darkened, the wind tugged at them from multiple directions. The snow that had been brief flurries and a constant black static against the sky became thicker, trying to constantly block out their vision, separate them from their party. They clipped ropes to their harnesses so they didn't get too far away from each other as visibility dropped. The enchanted goggles proved their worth when the first spike of sharpened ice dropped out of the sky in front of them. And then more and more of the aerial artillery started coming down. But none of them ever managed to find the Delvers. They were always just far enough out of the way of the dropping spikes. A snowdrift tried to eat them at one point, the mass of wet, white, unfurling icicle jaws under their feet as they tried to climb over it. Spire cast behind locked down the single opponent, and they moved past without incident. It decided not to give chase, if that was even an option. The deadly icefall picked up, and they took temporary shelter in an overhang set against one of the cliffs they didn't dare try until the storm ebbed. The overhang turned out to be more of a tunnel, and, curious, the group left Rudger to guard the entrance he couldn't fit through and poked their noses in. Their flashlights illuminated painted markings on the rock walls, wobbly abstract lines that were interspersed with hanging bits of metal, hubcaps, street signs, handfuls of coins. "Well, at least we know this dungeon makes money," James had said, poking at what looked like a perfectly normal quarter glued to the cave wall. The cave came to an abrupt end with a 4x4 grid of lines drawn on a too-smooth wall. Two of the squares in it were glowing, a soft blue light seeming to drip from the stone. "Okay, I'm not the smartest guy," Ethan said, folding his arms and looking back at the rest of them. "But we've all played this video game puzzle, right?" They had. With the rest of them watching for traps or ambushes, Ethan touched one of the squares with a gloved finger, and the squares adjacent to it lit up or went dark, respectively. James gave a respectful nod as Ethan made a series of rapid taps, quickly lighting the whole grid and firmly disproving his self-inflicted title of not the smartest guy. Then, the wall had slipped into the floor, and they had been met with an alcove. Within it, a raised pillar of smooth stone came up to about waist height, and on top of it, hundreds of hockey puck-sized gold coins sat glittering in the beams of their flashlights in neat stacks. "Oh, well, that's just fucking mean," Alana swore. "We're rich!" Ethan exclaimed. "We're already rich," James reminded him. "We could be richer. It's not like we don't have the backpack room since we found nothing else," Marlia said. Alana groaned loudly. "I feel like you guys are underestimating how fucking heavy gold is." "It's probably not solid gold," James suggested hopefully. "But, regardless, let's get this back to the entrance and split it up while we wait." They did so, each of them moving an armful of the metal coins. Alana was right, though. It was fucking heavy. Enough that when they did move on, the stack of coins in the bottom of James's pack made moving noticeably tougher. They navigated upward, taking more time to safely crawl their way up the cliffs and ledges, and spending a lot more effort to haul Rudger up after them. The Drake's developing office chair claws had trouble finding purchase on the increasingly treacherous and slippery stone. At one point, James spotted a line of streetlights stretching through the growing, glowing blizzard. Orange light glowing like small blazes in the darkening air. He pointed it out to the others, and they came to the quick decision to avoid it. From the curve, they assumed it was a ring, and from what they knew, those rings contained two things: blank spellbooks and the dragons that guarded them. They were prepared for a lot of stuff, but none of them would be immune or resistant to the emotional weapon that the dragons here had shown before. It hurt to pass up the chance, but James had learned this lesson repeatedly. It was not worth it to risk death just for a little magic, especially not when they could come back later. And then Marlia pointed out a landmark. A distant and barely visible red light in the sky, the top of a radio antenna that scraped the cloud layer. The group gathered behind a packed chunk of ice and snow and hunkered down. "That's it," Ethan said. "We're past the 2,000 line here." "What, just like that?" Alana asked, and James could feel her eyebrows raising under her ski mask. "That was easy." "We nearly died several times. Shut up," Ethan cheerfully replied as Marlia carefully pulled out a telepad and they started stripping gloves off to join hands. "And that was a 7-hour hike and climb. There are marathons that take less work than what we just did. If you want to come in and do your own exploration, that's cool. We'd love to have the maps, but this tour is up and we are out of here." Ethan's teammate tore the telepad without any further preamble, and just like that, their trip came to a close. Though Winter's Climb still wanted to get the last word in. Cowardice. Deception. Ascension, 2,399 feet. Bestowal, plus 66 breath storage, plus 1 available learning. The Lair's bath was, as far as James was concerned, their greatest contribution to the lives of everyone that lived and worked there. Or, at least, the biggest ongoing bonus. For some people, the greatest contribution was literally their lives, and he felt weird comparing saving somebody from certain death to unlimited hot water. But the unlimited hot water was really compelling. There was an evolving etiquette to the place that he was also becoming more comfortable with. He and Alana, when they'd gotten back sometime in the late afternoon, had found the bath actually fairly occupied. So they'd chosen one of the hot segments of it and just asked if the people minded company. Asking was important, as was the fact that anyone could say no for any reason and that was fine. As it was, the group in there already had been fine with it, and 2 of them were leaving anyway. It was still a little weird, being naked around other people, but any trepidation vanished when James claimed one of the spots under the heavy waterfall of hot water. It was like a good shower, only with enough water pressure to drown in, which was perfect. After he and Alana had warmed up and gotten the sweat and dirt from their long hike off, they'd wrapped up the story they were sharing with the other bathers, climbed out, tapped the water with the purify food power of the status quo brooch that was hanging on the wall, and headed out. "I think," Alana drawled out, "curry." "I have no idea how you're hungry." James shook his head at her. "I'm too sore to be hungry." "Well, I'm hungry," she declared with a grin. "And Anesh offered to treat me to one of the good curry places, so I'm going to do that. I guess I'll see you later tonight?" "Probably. Also, we live in a city with at least 6 good curry places. You have to be more specific." "No, I don't. Love you," Alana called as she waved over her shoulder and headed out to get lunch with their boyfriend. "I love you too. Tell Anesh I said something sappy," James yelled after her, shaking his head with a peaceful smile on his face as Alana's retreating form gave him a thumbs up. He didn't really know exactly how his life had ended up this way, but he kinda loved it. Also, as tired as he was, it was kind of a floaty tiredness. His muscles weren't even really hurting. The exercise potion had worked overtime and done its job perfectly. The hike and climb and the few fights hadn't been easy, but while he was a little sore, it was the kind of lingering soreness of having rested for a few days after a comprehensive workout, and nothing more. Between that feeling of satisfying growth and the warm bath, he was feeling pretty good, and with his thoughts relaxed and his outlook positive, he made a quick decision on how to spend the rest of his day before he could second-guess himself or fall into some kind of anxiety pit. It wasn't to fill his second spell slot. No, that would come later, and he still wasn't sure what book he wanted to use on it, if anything at all. He might just wait until they found another spell book. And it also wasn't to check in on the value of the gold they had brought back. James's brain wasn't wired for wealth, not really. They'd gotten rich enough to do some things, and he'd stopped thinking about it until they needed more money to do more things, at which point he would figure out some kind of dungeon solution. Instead, he wound his way through the basement hallways until he found himself moving through a space that was once a smooth, concrete-floored underground storage room, and was currently something a lot more livable. The apartments that the Order had put together, where a good chunk of their membership lived now, were wrapped around the walls of the room in a configuration that there absolutely was not enough space for. Each of the units was itself fairly mundane, but the way that the distance down and up to each one was different, the way that 3 stories of 2-bedroom apartments fit inside a single floor of a basement, and the way that there was cold winter sunlight pouring down from overhead despite the fact that they were underground, all sort of contributed to the instant recognition that this space was magical. In the middle of the courtyard that the horseshoe of living spaces surrounded, a series of 6 metal cylinders sat inside a low brick wall that ringed the art project. And it was an art project. James was one of the handful of people who knew that the orange totems that maintained the warped and replicated living spaces around him weren't here. Its actual location was somewhere much less public, much more secure. For most of the totems, anyway. The ones for which catastrophic failure just wasn't an option. The sculpture here did contain a few of the less dangerous ones, like the totem that kept the skylight up, or the one that made it so you didn't actually have to climb any stairs to make it to the second floor if you didn't want to. James made his way inside the left side of the apartments, though he did wonder if that distinction actually mattered as he passed by rows of doors that were way too close together for there to not be magic happening here, too. This was either spatial warping or a coffin motel, and he had a little inside knowledge on which one was more likely. When he got to the door he was looking for, he found himself paradoxically more nervous than he had been fighting for his life a few hours ago, which made him laugh to himself and made knocking itself a little bit easier. James shuffled his feet, trying to figure out how to look casual as he waited, and utterly failing to accomplish that. When the door cracked open, he jumped and jammed his hands in his pockets as a black-furred face peeked out at him. "Yes?" Kika's voice came through the small gap in the door with what sounded like more nerves than James had. "Oh, hey Kika," he said, smiling at the rat roach, who opened the door more fully as he heard James's voice outside. "How are things going?" Good." The rat roach gave 2 short nods of his triangular head, shifting to lean on the door with a pair of his arms. "I am getting better at talking," he said, the right side of his mouth cracking in a fanged smile. "The orb that grows our lungs is helping." The rat roach wiped the chitinous back of his paw across his mouth, catching a drop of corrosive blue drool before it could do anything damaging. "You all right?" he asked suddenly. "Why would I not be all right?" James asked, confused. "You don't come here often," Kika pointed out. "Oh. I mean, I was in the area? No, wow, that sounds intolerably stupid." James snorted as he got his conversational feet under himself, and Kika blinked and nodded at his comment. "Honestly, I was just going to talk to Arush while I was feeling okay." "Oh," Kika said, his multiple eyes flickering in relieved blinks as his shoulders slightly untensed. "That's good. There is nothing wrong." Then he stopped and pushed himself away from the door, leaving his apartment hanging open as he leaned forward on digitigrade legs to peer up at James with a sharp nose. The rat roach tilted his head, examining James's face, and then pulled back again. "Oh," he said suddenly. Yes." He nodded as James realized that trying to be circumspect was meaningless with this particular rat roach. "Arush is not here," Kika said suddenly. "Oh." James felt like that word was getting a lot of use today. "Well, dang." He sighed. "He's in Tennessee," Kika informed him with an excellent mispronunciation of the state name. "Kirk is teaching him to drive." He sounded a strange mix of sad and proud, but James might have been reading too far into the tone of voice for a non-human speaker. "Do you want to come in?" he asked James suddenly. James smiled and shrugged. "Yeah, sure," he said, stepping forward as Kika moved back to let him into the apartment that he shared with Arush. "I don't think I've actually been in your apartment. I moved a lot of furniture down here, but I never made the last jump with it." He mused as Kika shut the door and locked it rapidly, then another lock that James was pretty sure wasn't standard. Then he peeked out the peephole. Are you doing all right? James asked Kika as he stood awkwardly in the living room. Fine, why? The rat roach actually did seem okay as he moved past James, seeming much more comfortable now that the door was closed. Kika settled down on the black upholstered couch that dominated the back wall of the room, pulling his skirt up and folding his legs into a splayed pattern as he sat next to a pair of large padded headphones. The apartment was sparsely decorated, and had a kind of chaotic clutter to it. A big couch, a couple tall stools up against the kitchen counter, a tall stereo speaker set up in the corner. There wasn't really anything on the walls, which gave it a bare feeling, and there were different bits of clothing or books or electronics set haphazardly on every surface. James noticed the kitchen also had a fair number of dishes in it, which he felt almost unnaturally compelled to clean. The place reminded him a lot of his own apartment when he had first moved out, before he'd figured out a cleaning routine. Small chores and little messes piling up and creating a situation. "Oh, you just seem nervous," James said, leaning on the edge of the couch. "And, I care about you guys." Kika nodded rapidly at him, his hands toying with the headphones like they were a fidget toy. "We know," he said happily. "I don't like the door open, that's all." He glanced down the hallway and away from James. "Everyone's nice and I'm still hiding," he muttered. "Heh, man, that's fine," James said. "I just won't stand out in the hallway so long next time. That's easy." He gave a small chuckle. "A lot of people have stuff like that that bothers them, It's not bad or anything. Just let me know if I do anything so I can avoid it." "My therapist says that..." Kika looked up at James, and James suddenly realized how much Kika was directly meeting his gaze, no longer trying to keep his head ducked all the time. "She says it's a work in progress." "Your therapist sounds cool." James grinned back at him. "So what have you been up to lately? I haven't really seen you around since we went to the beach what feels like 2, 3 lifetimes ago." "Music." Kika's voice still shook as he talked a little bit. "Pottery. And waiting. Waiting. Talking to the doctors. Preparing to change again." He shivered, bringing his smaller arm up to rub at his muzzle. "And a rush," he added, his mouth twisting into a smile. James barked out a surprised laugh at the phrasing Kika had chosen, sliding forward over the arm of the couch to sit. "Sorry," he said, as Kika stared at him intensely. "Sorry, I just, the way you phrased that sounded maybe unintentionally lewd?" The rat roach nodded, ignoring the drip of corrosive saliva that dropped down to the sleeve of his sweatshirt. "Yes," he said, and then looked down at where James was uncomfortably sprawled on the other side of his seat. "Not unintentional. We can be lewd here, and no one will kill us. You still don't know." Kika's voice hitched as he spoke. "You don't know what it means to us, what you gave us. No one here hurts. Not really. So no, not unintentional. Just what I meant." Kika looked away from James, tilting his angular head up to stare at a corner of the ceiling. "Then I'm sorry for being an ass," James said instantly. "Though if you meant it to be funny, you did a great job. Also, I don't know. I think I know how horrible your lives were. I'm just glad you feel safer here." He sighed as he righted himself and settled into the couch cushions near Kika's spot. "Also, backing up a bit, you're still working on the Shaper substance thing? How's that going?" "Good." Kika whipped his head back around as he refocused on the conversation. His breath came in fast bursts, and his heart was pounding as what James said washed over him, but he was grateful for the change in topic. "I have a plan for what I will be." His hands turned the headphones he was holding over in a steady rhythm as he spoke. "It will hurt, but it will make me better. Organs first, Deb says, so I study and I get ready. Next week." To James, the rat roach sounded more nervous than excited. Without thinking, he reached over and set a hand on Kika's head, rustling his wiry fur affectionately. "I'm sure it'll go great," he said. "I think at this point we can safely say Deb is far from reckless with this stuff, right?" Right, Kika said, a ripple of tension going through his arms as James made contact with him before he relaxed slightly and leaned into the hand on his head. James smiled and left his hand there, among the rat roach's antennae, for a few lingering seconds before he pulled back. So, what are you going to look like? He asked. Better, the rat roach said instantly. James blinked and forcibly stilled a laugh. That is... It's a surprise, Kika said, folding his arms, his own toothy smile slipping just a little. So that if I do it wrong, it won't be a problem. James huffed at him. Bah, he said dramatically. But also, maybe focus on your internal organs more than how you look, okay? He let a little bit of pleading enter his tone. I don't want you dying because you think you don't look good already. I don't look good, Kika said, one paw coming up without thought to tug at the hood of his sweatshirt, though he refrained from pulling it over his head entirely. It's hard to forget that I'm a monst... Stop! James commanded abruptly, pointing a finger at Kika with a storm brewing in his eyes. But... No, James restated. No self-depreciation over body image here. He let his voice soften. I admit I might be the wrong person to say this because I don't like how I look either, but wow, you do not get to call yourself that, okay? Not here. James watched Kika as the rat roach recoiled slightly, but eventually he gave a small nod of acceptance back. Good, he stated. Now, that said, it's still fine to change yourself to look more like what you want, but also, I don't know, maybe I'll call a Rush and ask him what he thinks about how you look, just to embarrass you into submission. That is mean, Kika protested. And unfair. He paused, and then stared at James with a little cunning in his expression. May I borrow your phone? Sure, why? James reflexively had already started to pull his phone out of his pocket. To call Anesh. Kika stretched out James's boyfriend's name as he spoke. James slowly retreated the phone he was holding out across the couch cushion. No, he said slowly, because that would ruin me being unfair. He barked out a laugh and jerked back as Kika suddenly lunged across the couch at him, the black-furred rat roach uncoiling his legs in a burst of motion that speared him toward James, trying to snatch the phone in what was still clearly a playful motion. In a moment, James found himself holding his phone over his head as all of Kika's arms pressed down on his face and shoulders, the comparatively light creature trying to scramble up him like his sitting form was a tower to be climbed. Still laughing, so hard he was running out of breath, James toppled backward, hitting his head against the arm of the couch with an audible crack as he fell with Kika landing in his lap. No! Kika's voice turned terrified in an instant as he sprawled onto James. Ow! James was less worried, and more just feeling benign amusement, and a small headache. Oof, that was dumb of me, he mumbled. I'm fine, don't worry. He looked down his prone form at Kika, who was staring up at him with wide, insectile eyes. You okay? He asked the rat roach that was currently half laying on top of him. My boyfriend likes you, Kika said suddenly, shifting against James. James lowered his arms slowly, tucking his phone back into his pocket as he sighed. Yeah, I know, he said. I have no idea how to feel about it, or what to do about it, or anything. I was going to try to talk to him today, which is, why I came by, but also I was secretly planning to chicken out and instead be awkward about it, or make some excuse about wanting to just have a conversation or go on a walk or something. Why? Kika seemed genuinely confused by James's words. Because I'm constantly terrified of driving away people I like, James shrugged, feeling Kika's limbs shift against him as he moved. I think it's a human thing. We're really bad at being emotionally open and shit. And, I know it's largely cultural, and I want it to stop, so I'm trying to build a world where the kids we've got around here can grow up better, but that doesn't make me less scared. Kika tilted his head down to rest on his arm, looking away as he softly crushed James's stomach with his weight. I don't think of you as scared, he mumbled. James didn't reply right away, and Kika continued when he'd had a minute to collect his thoughts. You seem always like you know. To be fair, half the time you see me there is a major crisis going on, James pointed out. I get really focused when people are shooting at me. I understand, Kika said, with a simple acceptance of the fact that came far too easily to not make James's heart hurt a little to hear it. I do understand. He perked up suddenly, staring out at the empty living room like he'd just realized something. You don't... Kika took a deep breath, his lungs aching from prolonged conversation, but his new enhancements making it possible for him to talk this long in the first place for the first time ever in his life. You don't have to be afraid of me, he told James, still looking away from him. You tell us, all the time, but no one ever tells you, do they? Kika asked suddenly. I guess not, James admitted. It was almost funny, but he kept back his reflex to laugh at everything. It didn't feel right in the moment. Anesh and Alana do sometimes. Sarah, obviously. Of course. Kika gave a bobbing nod, wiping his thinner arm against his mouth as he agreed. But yeah, no one ever really just lets anyone know that everything is okay, huh? James let himself flop back onto the couch. Maybe that's why the world sucks so much. He took a deep breath. Thanks, though, he told the rat roach that was sitting on him. I like you too, Kika said suddenly, his voice scratchy and wavering, the exposed skin around his eyes coloring a bright green as he tried to not stare at a wall while he spoke. James paused as his brain caught up to the implication of that, and the realization that Kika did not mean that in a simple friendship way. Suddenly he was absolutely unprepared for this conversation, which he had almost literally nothing to say about. He settled on, trying to fill the awkward gap in the words he was saying. I'm sorry, Kika stammered, suddenly jerking away, rolling off of James and onto the floor, landing on a multitude of uneven limbs in a motion that was asymmetrically graceful. I didn't... Suddenly James found he did know what to say. Okay, hold on, he said, sitting up. Don't panic, please. Deep breaths. He gave Kika a worried look. You don't need to apologize for anything. We've been over this. I just wasn't expecting that. Man, I came here already not knowing what I should say to one person. Now I'm just doubly uncertain and confused. Do you not like us? Kika asked. Normally, if somebody had said that to James, it would have made him actually kind of angry. That sort of sentence to him had always felt like emotional blackmail when he had heard it before. But Kika's tone wasn't one that was trying to drag sympathy or pity out of him. Instead, it sounded like true curiosity. And maybe that was James misinterpreting it because Kika's voice wasn't quite human, and it could be hard sometimes to tell, but he was pretty sure that Kika was really just trying to figure things out too, just like him. So his answer was more measured, and he tried to be more openly honest, the way he wanted the world to work. I don't know, James said simply. I think I do, but I'm also worried because you two you're new, you know? New to all of this. And you've both been so hurt from how awful your lives have been, and I don't know if I know you well enough, or if this would be taking advantage of you, and all of that is on top of worrying about screwing everything up in a more normal context. I'm not that new, Kika protested. I'm one of the oldest of my kind. His voice took on a wet hiss as he spoke, his teeth showing in an awkward grin. Kika, chronologically, you and a Rush are, what, 3, 4? That is unsettling to me. I know. But you're also people, and it's confusing. Everything about our world is confusing, and now there's even more moving parts to be confused by. James chuckled. I was going to talk to Rush about how I didn't want to rush into anything if he wasn't in a mentally and emotionally healthy place. I think he's been actually avoiding therapy. He isn't. He just doesn't think it's important. Kika gave a sigh, splattering a corrosive drip on his shirt. That's not good either, James pointed out. No, Kika sighed again. Excuse doesn't work on me, though, he pointed out. James let out a laugh at Kika's words. Well, you had me there, he admitted. We should talk more, all of us at some point, and I don't know, we should actually spend time together. And then, I don't know, then we can figure everything out as we go. James realized that this wasn't exactly a plan so much as it was deferring the problem onto his future self. Talking, though, that's important. Do you have any idea how many problems communication solves? He asked rhetorically. Yes, Kika said abruptly. Most of them. He looked down at his claws, rubbing them together with light scratches. James tilted his head slightly as he noticed that the claws on Kika's fingers were visibly blunted. I like it. It's why music is so... He shrugged, rolling his shoulders with a creak of flexing chitin. It makes me feel. Kika tried to sum up his thoughts. James swung his legs around to sit up properly on the couch, looking down at Kika as he latched onto the easier conversation topic. What you been listening to, anyway? Linkin Park. The space around Kika's eyes again tinged green. They sound... He trailed off. They kind of sound like they understand being hurt, James said softly. Yeah, I actually listened to a ton of them when I was younger, and then I sort of fell out of liking them, 'cause I thought I was growing up, but that was stupid. I went back and listened to some of their music pretty recently, after I knew what was wrong with my own brain. He tapped a knuckle against his skull. And yeah, it feels painfully relevant a lot of the time. He thought for a second. I should loan you all my Metric albums, James said, mostly to himself. I can tell they've hurt too, Kika said. I don't know why, but it makes me feel better. Yeah, James sighed. There's something about it, knowing that... Not just knowing that somebody feels like you do, but like they made art out of it. I love that shit. It's powerful. Also guitar, Kika excitedly hissed the words. James snapped his fingers, and then decided to never do that again as he noticed Kika flinch away from it. Fun fact, the guitarist actually has a Twitch channel. He streams himself making new songs. It's really cool. He looked over at Kika, who had opened his mouth to say something, but then abruptly stopped and doubled over as he started coughing. Oh hell, James whispered, dropping off the couch to place a hand on the rat roach's back, trying to make sure he wasn't choking on something. Kiko limply pushed him back, though, and shook his head, eyes pressed closed in a glare. Fine, he gasped out. Breathing hard. Yeah, James murmured. Okay, how about we talk more later, okay? He suggested. You relax for a while, catch your breath. We'll sort everything out when you're feeling better. Kika pivoted his head to look up at James, half his eyes forced open with glistening liquid in their corners. Sorry. No, James cut him off again with a friendly word. You didn't do anything to apologize for. Besides, this gives me a chance to freak out at my own speed as I decide if I've screwed everything up or not. That is valuable time right there, James joked. And then, because he realized Kika's stare was a little horrified, quickly added, That is mostly a joke. Now, I'm sorry. No. Kika drew the word out, placing one paw on James's face before he devolved into coughing again as a laugh caught in his lungs. All right. James helped him up, standing himself. He was going to get the rat roach settled on the couch, but as he did so, Kika pressed into him, wrapping his arms around James's torso. James froze briefly, but slowly returned the hug, placing his arms carefully on Kika's back so as not to crush the smaller rat roach. "Okay, you sit, and I don't know, we'll figure out a good time to hang out later, okay?" Kika nodded back as James pulled away. "Thanks for talking," James said with a smile, as he moved to show himself out. "Oh, the door. Do you want to lock—" "Okay, yep." Kika had bolted upright and was right behind James as he headed down the small hallway to the apartment's front door. "And now I'm gonna go, I don't know, do something relaxing. My legs hurt," he mused to himself as he left, the rat roach seeming fine with allowing the conversation to come to an abrupt end as he gave James one last fanged smile and rapidly closed and locked the door. James took a deep breath of the clear air in the spatially warped apartment complex's central hallway. That had, technically, gone better than he expected. He still had no idea what he was doing. "I'm going to go to random Thai restaurants in town until I find Nesh and Alana," James decided to himself. "They'll know what to... no." James gnawed at his lips as he vocalized his thoughts. "No, they'll be snarky. But I do want curry now." He pulled out his phone and texted Anesh. He could put up with some snark if it meant getting dinner. Especially now. He was in an unusually good mood.